December 11th, 1978, 3 in the morning, John F. Kennedy International Airport, New York. A black Ford van pulls up to the service entrance of Lufthansa Cargo Terminal 261. The men inside have been planning this for months. They know which guards are on duty. They know which locks respond to which keys. They know exactly where the money is kept, how much of it there is, and how long they have before the next patrol comes through. This is not a desperate crime. This is engineering. In the next 90 minutes, they will walk out of that terminal with $5 million, at $875,000 in cash, plus jewelry. At the time, the largest cash robbery in the history of the United States, the FBI would later call it one of the most sophisticated heists ever executed on American soil. And here's the part nobody tells you. The crew got away clean, every guard subdued, every camera avoided, every dollar accounted for. They loaded the money into the van, drove to a staging area in Brooklyn, transferred everything into smaller cars, and dispersed. The van, the only vehicle that connected them to the crime, needed to disappear. One man, one job. Drive it to a junkyard in New Jersey, put it in the compactor, walk away, that's it. That's the whole job. And that man went to his girlfriend's apartment, parked the van in front of a fire hydrant, and went to sleep. 2 days later, a patrol car ran the plates, stolen. And from that moment, the largest cash heist in American history, perfectly executed, months in the planning, began to unravel. Not because of brilliant detective work, not because of a federal investigation, not because anyone talked, because of a parking violation. This is the story of Parnell Stacks Edwards, the man who had one job, and what it cost everyone around him that he didn't do it. To understand what happened in December 1978, you have to go back about 30 years. You have to go to the South Bronx. In the 1950s, the South Bronx was not the wasteland it would become in the 1970s. It was a working neighborhood, dense, alive. The kind of place where you heard 6 languages on a single block, where kids played in the street until the lights came on, and where families that had migrated from the South were still in the process of building something. Parnell Edwards was born into that neighborhood on January 15th, 1947. His parents were African American, with roots in North Carolina and Northern Virginia, part of the Great Migration, the decades-long movement of black families out of the South and into the industrial North. By looking for work that paid a living wage and a life with fewer locked doors, they found some of what they were looking for, and in their apartment, somewhere in that dense block of the South Bronx, there was music. Parnell took to it early. By the time he was a teenager, he was playing guitar, not casually, seriously, blues rock, the kind with weight behind it, the kind that takes years to sound effortless. He was good enough that by his early 20s, he was booking gigs at clubs across New York. Not just local spots, real venues, the kind of nightclubs that had a back office where men sat with ledgers and nobody asked too many questions. That was the geography of the New York music scene in the late 1960s. Bars and lounges and late-night clubs. See, many of them owned or frequented by people with connections to the Cosa Nostra, the 5 families that had divided New York's underworld into their own private territories. Parnell Edwards was not a gangster when he started playing those clubs. He was a musician who happened to play well in the kind of rooms where gangsters drank. That distinction mattered, for a while. The man who changed everything had a name that sounded almost cheerful. Thomas Desimone. They called him Tommy Two Guns. Desimone was an associate of the Lucchese crime family, specifically of the crew run out of a bar in South Ozone Park, Queens, called Robert's Lounge. The man who ran that crew was named James Burke, but we'll get to Burke. First, Desimone. By the accounts of people who knew him, Thomas Desimone was magnetic, funny, and the kind of man who could fill a room with energy and make everyone feel like they were the most important person he'd ever met. He was also, by those same accounts, capable of extreme and sudden violence. The FBI later described him as a psychopathic personality. The people who worked with him described him more simply, unpredictable. When Desmond noticed Parnell Edwards at one of those clubs, a big man on stage, working a guitar with the kind of ease that comes from a decade of practice, he didn't see a musician. He saw a useful person. Edwards was black. In a world where Italian faces were known to every detective in every precinct in Queens and Brooklyn, a black associate was operationally valuable. He moved through spaces that the crew couldn't. He didn't have the same heat on him. Desmond introduced himself, and Parnell Edwards, and over the course of the next several months, was drawn into the orbit of Robert's Lounge, not with a recruitment pitch, not with threats, with money, with belonging, with the slow gravitational pull of a world where the rules were different and the rewards were immediate. That's always how it starts. By the early 1970s, Parnell Edwards had a role, and he was, by all accounts, very good at it. Henry Hill, who would later become the government's most important witness against the Lucchese family, described Edwards with a specific kind of respect. He called him a master of the under-the-limit game. That phrase needs explaining. In the 1970s, before instantaneous digital verification existed, every retail store in America operated with a credit card threshold, a specific dollar amount below which a store employee could complete a transaction without calling the bank for authorization. The number varied by store and by region, but it was always there, always known, and almost never enforced perfectly. Edwards knew this. He didn't just know the threshold. He had mapped it. He knew which stores in which neighborhoods operated with which limits, which managers were attentive and which weren't, which times of day the verification calls were most likely to be made. He built a network, distributors, runners, people, men and women, who would hit 30, 40, sometimes 50 stores in a single day, using stolen or cloned credit cards, purchasing merchandise in quantities that looked normal for a single transaction. Electronics, clothing, appliances, anything that could move, always under the limit. The merchandise would be loaded into trucks, literally truckloads, not bags, and taken to warehouses in Harlem or to loading docks in New Jersey, where businesses that asked no questions about where inventory came from would buy entire shipments at reduced prices. The money came back in cash, so always cash. This was not small-time street crime. This was a logistics operation, run with the precision of a small business, generating a consistent and significant cash flow for Jimmy Burke's crew and for Paul Vario, the capo who oversaw them. Edwards was what the mob called a gopher, an associate, not a made member, someone who operated on the edges of the organization. But he was a gopher at a very high level, trusted, productive, financially valuable. The nickname Stax came from this period. Some people said it referred to his record collection, stacks of vinyl albums, lined up in his apartment in Ozone Park, Queens. Edwards never fully abandoned his music. He still played the occasional club gig. And he still had guitars, but Henry Hill and the men at Robert's Lounge connected the name to something else. Stacks of money, the piles of cash that moved through his operation. The organized stacks of bills that came back from the fence operations, counted and bundled and handed up the chain. It was a name that fit a man who moved money like other men moved furniture. Methodically, at scale, without drama. There is one detail about Parnell Edwards that almost every documentary about the Lufthansa Heist leaves out, and it tells you something about the kind of life he was actually living. In the 1970s, Muhammad Ali was the most famous athlete on earth, possibly the most famous man on earth. And when Ali moved through public spaces, airports, press events, fight venues, the crowds that gathered were enormous, dense, and difficult to manage. Ali needed people who could move through those crowds and create space. Parnell Edwards was one of them. He worked as a crowd clearer for Muhammad Ali during public appearances in the mid-1970s. If you look at the archival footage, and it exists scattered through the documentary record of that era, you can find him. A large man, arms wide, moving people back so Ali could walk. Think about what that means for a moment. In the same years that Parnell Edwards was running a stolen credit card operation across New York, generating cash for one of the most feared crews in the Lucchese family, he was also standing at Muhammad Ali's shoulder during public appearances, moving in the orbit of one of the defining cultural figures of the 20th century, two lives, running simultaneously. They're both completely real. That was Parnell Edwards, and in December 1978, Jimmy Burke needed both of those lives, the discipline of the operator and the size of the man, for one specific task. To understand why Stax Edwards had that one job on the night of December 11th, you have to understand James Burke. Jimmy the Gent Burke was not a made member of the Lucchese family. He was Irish. The family rules were explicit. You had to be of full Italian descent to be formally inducted into the organization. But rules in the New York underworld had always bent for men who were sufficiently useful, and Burke was extraordinarily useful. He had been robbing trucks since he was a teenager. Not randomly, systematically. He studied airport and freight operations the way an engineer studies infrastructure. He understood cargo logistics, shift schedules, cargo manifest patterns, and security vulnerabilities at JFK Airport specifically. He had cultivated relationships with workers and supervisors over years, creating a network of insiders who fed him information for a share of the take. By the late 1970s, Burke's crew at Robert's Lounge had executed dozens of successful heists. They were known, within the organization, as the best in the business at exactly this kind of job. And Robert's Lounge itself was the center of gravity for all of it, a bar in South Ozone Park, Queens. Unremarkable from the outside. Inside, a place where the men who planned and executed crimes in the borough of Queens gathered, drank, and kept each other's secrets. Stax Edwards had been coming to Robert's Lounge for years. The tip that led to the Lufthansa Heist came from inside JFK cargo supervisor named Louis Werner. Werner was in his 40s, had worked for Lufthansa's freight operation at Kennedy Airport for years, and had developed a serious gambling problem. Serious enough that his debts had become dangerous. He needed money, a significant amount of it, and he was sitting every working day inside a facility that received and processed enormous quantities of untraceable cash. The specific opportunity Werner had identified was this. Lufthansa regularly received shipments of American currency from West Germany, dollars that had circulated through the German economy and were being returned to the United States. These were physical banknotes, bundled and packaged, transported in the cargo hold. The currency was not tracked the way individual serial numbers might suggest. It moved in bulk, and the paperwork, while thorough, created a window of vulnerability between receipt and final accounting. Werner knew the schedule, he knew the amounts, and he knew the layout of the cargo facility. He needed a buyer for that information. He went to a man named Martin Krugman, a bookmaker, the kind of person who might know people who might know people. Krugman brought the information to Henry Hill. Hill brought it to Jimmy Burke. Burke listened to the full briefing, asked questions that revealed he already understood the operational landscape of JFK better than Werner did, and then said he would look into it. What followed was months of preparation. Burke did not rush. He sent scouts. He studied the terminal layout, the guard rotations, the timing of the cargo deliveries. He identified every potential complication and built contingencies for each one. The team he assembled for the actual job was not random. These were men he had worked with, men whose specific capabilities he knew. Tommy DeSimone, Stax Edwards' original connection to Robert's Lounge, was on the crew. Angelo Sipi, a brutal and effective operator with a long history of violence. Several others, each assigned to a specific function. The plan called for a fast, controlled entry. Subdue the guards, locate the vault, remove the contents, exit, the vehicle for entry and initial transport, a black Ford Econoline 150 van. And after the money was transferred, after the crew had dispersed and the immediate heat of the robbery had passed, the van needed to disappear completely. Fingerprints, shoe prints, fibers, hair, the kind of physical evidence that forensic teams could use to connect known associates to a specific crime scene. All of it was in that van. Burke was meticulous about evidence. He understood, with the precision of someone who had studied law enforcement methodology for decades, exactly what investigators look for and how they connect physical trace evidence to suspects. The van could not simply be abandoned. It could not be left on a quiet street. It had to be destroyed. Completely, in a compactor, at a junkyard, controlled by John Gotti in New Jersey, reduced to a compressed cube of metal from which no fingerprint, no fiber, no trace of any kind could ever be recovered. That was the job. That was Stax Edwards' job. At 3:12 in the morning on December 11th, 1978, the black Ford Econoline van pulled up to the service entrance of Lufthansa Cargo Terminal 261 at John F. Kennedy International Airport. The crew was in position. The entry was swift, controlled, exactly as rehearsed. Inside the terminal, the guards on duty were subdued, bound and held while the crew worked. No shots were fired, no alarms were triggered. The operation proceeded with the tempo of men who had done versions of this before and knew what efficiency looked like. They located the vault. They opened it. Inside, bundled American currency, stacked and organized. More of it than Werner had estimated, as it turned out. Werner had put the figure at around $2 million. The actual take would come out to $5,875,000 in cash, so plus approximately $1 million in jewelry, nearly $7 million in total. At 4:21 a.m., 69 minutes after entry, the crew exited the terminal and loaded into the van. The drive to the staging area in Canarsie, Brooklyn, took roughly 20 minutes. At the staging area, the money was transferred, counted, separated, distributed into ordinary-looking sedans and private cars that would scatter across the borough. Each driver had a specific destination, a specific route, a specific time window. Burke watched this process with the same precision he had applied to every stage of the operation. When the transfer was complete, he turned to Parnell Edwards. The instructions were clear. Drive the van to Ragnancy Salvage, a junkyard in New Jersey. John Gotti controlled it. They were expecting him. The van would go into the compactor. He'd done. No evidence, no trail, no connection between the van that had entered Terminal 261 and any of the men who had been inside it. Edwards took the keys. He got in the van. He drove. For a period of time, nobody knows exactly how long, Parnell Edwards drove in the right direction, and then he didn't. Instead of the bridge into New Jersey, he took the streets back into Brooklyn, into Canarsie, to the apartment building where his girlfriend lived. He parked the van. On the street, in front of a fire hydrant, he went upstairs. The state Parnell Edwards was in during the hours following the heist is documented in testimony and in the accounts of people who knew him and the situation. He had been drinking. He had been using cocaine, possibly marijuana, possibly something else. This matters, not as an excuse, but as operational context. The professional who had moved truckloads of stolen merchandise across New York for a decade, who had managed logistics for a credit card fraud operation running across dozens of stores simultaneously, who had been trusted enough to be given the single most critical post-heist task in the largest cash robbery in American history. That professional was not present in the apartment above Canarsie on the morning of December 11th, 1978. What was present was a man compromised by addiction at the worst possible moment. Edwards fell asleep. The van stayed where it was. The hydrant it was parked in front of stayed where it was. December 11th became December 12th. December 12th became December 13th. On December 13th, 1978, a New York Police Department patrol car came down the street in Canarsie. Standard patrol. The officers were not looking for a van connected to the largest cash robbery in American history. They saw a vehicle parked in front of a fire hydrant. They ran the plates. The plates came back as stolen. Protocol: tow the vehicle to the impound lot for processing. The van was towed. At the impound lot, when the vehicle was flagged for further examination, stolen plates triggered a more thorough review. Forensic technicians went through it. What they found was not subtle. Clear fingerprints, multiple surfaces, recoverable, a shoe print, distinct tread pattern. The fingerprints were run through the system. Parnell Stacks Edwards, known associate of James Burke's crew at Roberts Lounge, South Ozone Park, Queens. Prior record: credit card fraud, theft, known to law enforcement. Here is what that fingerprint actually meant from an investigative standpoint. It was not, by itself, a case. A fingerprint in a van does not prove a robbery, but it was a thread, and the investigators at the FBI and the NYPD, who had been woken up at 6 in the morning on December 11th when Lufthansa called to report the robbery, needed a thread more than they needed almost anything else. They now knew that a vehicle physically connected to the crime had been in the hands of a known Lucchese associate. That connected them to Roberts Lounge, which connected them to Jimmy Burke, which connected them to Henry Hill, which connected them eventually to everyone who had been in that terminal, not immediately. The investigation would take years to fully develop, but the thread existed, because of a fire hydrant, because of a stolen plate check, because of a man who had one job and didn't do it. The news reached Jimmy Burke. The accounts of how he reacted, drawn from Henry Hill's testimony and from the recollections of people who were close to the situation, describe a man who moved through several distinct emotional states very quickly. Disbelief, then rage, then something colder. Burke had spent months planning this job. He had assigned the post-heist destruction of the van as a task he considered simple, the kind of thing that didn't require a strategic mind, just reliability and follow-through. He had trusted Edwards with it. Edwards had failed, but Burke's concern in the days after the van was found was not primarily anger. It was calculus. Edwards was now identifiable. His fingerprints were in the van. Law enforcement knew who he was, knew his associations, knew exactly where to find him. More importantly, Edwards was a black associate in an organization where almost every significant figure was of Italian descent. He had no blood ties to the family, no institutional protection, no made member status that would generate political pressure within the organization to protect him. What Edwards had was information. The names of the men who had been in Terminal 261, the location of the staging area, the names of the drivers who had taken the money. A federal prosecutor looking at a man with fingerprints in a robbery vehicle, facing serious time with no family loyalty to call on. That was not a complicated calculation. That was an offer. An immunity in exchange for names. Burke couldn't let that conversation happen. He made a decision. He went to Paul Vario, the Lucchese capo who oversaw the crew, and got the authorization he needed. Then he called Tommy De Simone and Angelo Sepe. He told them to handle it. 7 days after the heist. December 18th, 1978. The apartment was in Ozone Park, Queens. De Simone and Sepe knocked on the door. Edwards let them in. These were not strangers to him. De Simone was the man who had first introduced him to Roberts Lounge years earlier. The man who had seen him play guitar in a club and decided he was worth knowing. They had worked together for a decade. Edwards had no reason to think this visit was anything other than what it appeared to be. Two members of the crew coming by to talk. The accounts of what happened next come from Henry Hill's testimony and from court records. One version says Edwards was eating when they arrived, that when his body was found later, there was still food nearby, the remnants of a meal he had been in the middle of. Another version, more detailed and more widely cited, and says that DeSimone told Edwards they needed to move, that there was a place he needed to go, that it was safer. Edwards sat down on the edge of the bed. He began to put on his socks. DeSimone pulled a .25 caliber revolver equipped with a suppressor. He fired 5 shots, possibly 6, head and chest, at close range. When they left, DeSimone and Sepe placed the body under the covers, an attempt to delay discovery, to make it look, at a distance, like a man asleep in his bed. They left the apartment clean. They removed what they had brought. They left his money on the nightstand. His records were still on the shelves, the stacks of vinyl albums, lined up the way they always were. His guitar was still in the corner. They left all of it, because this wasn't theft. This was a message, sent to nobody in particular. Here, because dead men don't receive messages. Parnell stacks. Edwards was 31 years old. He was the first name on a list that Jimmy Burke had just started writing. In the weeks and months that followed, Jimmy Burke continued writing that list. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who had first connected Louis Werner's tip to Henry Hill, disappeared on January 6, 1979. He was never found. Louis Kafora, one of the drivers who had transported the money from the Canarsie staging area, was killed in March 1979. His wife was killed alongside him. Burke had decided that a man with a wife who talked too much was twice the liability. Joe Manry and Robert McMahon, both members of the crew, were killed in May 1979. The bodies were found together. Paolo Licastri, a representative connected to the Gambino family who had knowledge of the operation, was killed in June 1979. By the summer of 1979, nearly everyone who had direct knowledge of what had happened inside Terminal 261 on the morning of December 11, 1978, was dead. Burke had achieved something remarkable. He had eliminated the witnesses. He had created a situation where the physical evidence, the van, the fingerprints, the forensic trace, pointed to a dead man who could not testify. On paper, this looked like the operation Burke had always intended, clean. But Burke had made a miscalculation. The violence itself was a signal. In the world of federal law enforcement, when associates of a known organized crime crew begin disappearing in rapid succession in the months following a major robbery, that pattern is not invisible. It is, in fact, so one of the clearest signals available that something large happened and someone powerful is trying to cover it. Every disappearance tightened the FBI's attention on Robert's Lounge. Every body created a new investigative thread, and the sheer scale of the purge, the number of people Burke eliminated, had created a climate of fear inside his own organization that was becoming difficult to manage. Henry Hill was watching all of it. He watched Krugman disappear. He watched Kafora disappear. He watched the men he had worked alongside for years get eliminated one by one, and he understood, with the clarity that comes from proximity to violence, that his own name could appear on that list at any moment. Hill was also facing a separate problem, and he had developed a significant drug trafficking operation that was entirely his own, outside of Burke's oversight and against the explicit wishes of the Lucchese leadership. When that operation drew federal attention in 1980, Hill was arrested, and in 1980, Henry Hill made a decision. He walked into an FBI field office. He sat down across from agents who had been building a case against the Roberts Lounge crew for 2 years, and he started talking. He talked about the Lufthansa Heist. He talked about the staging area in Canarsie. He talked about the money and the cars and the distribution. He talked about Parnell Edwards and the van. He talked about what happened to Parnell Edwards when Burke found out about the van. He talked about Krugman, about Kafora. It's about Manry and McMahon. He talked for months. James Burke was ultimately convicted, not for the Lufthansa heist itself, which prosecutors were never able to build a case around to the standard required for trial. He was convicted for other crimes, the murder of a man named Richard Eaton, connected to a separate scheme, for his role in a point-shaving scandal involving the Boston College basketball team. He went to prison. He died there in April 1996 at the age of 64. Tommy DeSimone never collected his share of the Lufthansa money. He was killed by the Gambino family in January 1979, almost certainly in retaliation for the murder of a made Gambino member named Billy Batts, which DeSimone had carried out years earlier without authorization. He disappeared, and his body was never found. Angelo Sepe was shot dead in 1984 in a dispute unrelated to the heist. Paul Vario, the capo who had overseen Burke's crew and authorized the elimination of Stax Edwards, died in federal prison in 1988. The money, $5,875,000, was never fully recovered. Martin Scorsese put the Lufthansa heist on screen in 1990. In Goodfellas, Parnell Edwards is played by Samuel L. Jackson. The scene is brief. Edwards is shown asleep, missed the job entirely out of laziness. Tommy and another man come in. He's killed in bed. The real Stax Edwards was not asleep when they came. He was awake, sitting on the edge of a bed, pulling on his socks. He thought he was going somewhere safe. The film got the broad outlines right. The van, the hydrant, the execution. What it couldn't fully capture was the man himself. The musician who had played blues in clubs across New York for a decade. The operator who had moved more merchandise through stolen credit card schemes than almost anyone in the borough. The man who stood at Muhammad Ali's shoulder in front of 10,000 people. Goodfellas compressed him into a punchline, a cautionary moment before the real story continued. He was more than that. The case of Parnell Edwards is, in the literature of criminology, frequently cited as an example of what researchers call operational fragility, the tendency of even well-constructed criminal enterprises to contain single points of failure that are invisible until they activate. Burke's crew had executed the logistics of the heist with near-perfect precision. The post-heist protocols were thorough and well-designed, but there was one task, one job, that depended entirely on one person following through, and that person was compromised in ways that weren't visible until the moment it mattered. A van, a fire hydrant, 2 days. That's the distance between a perfect crime and a federal investigation that dismantled one of the most effective criminal crews in the history of Queens, New York. The money is gone. The crew is gone. Robert's Lounge is gone. The building is still there. But it's been other things since. And Parnell Stax Edwards is gone, buried in a cemetery in Queens, not far from the neighborhood where he built his career and made his mistake and trusted the wrong men. His guitar is presumably gone too. But somewhere, in the archive footage of Muhammad Ali in the 1970s, you can still find him. A large man, arms wide, moving the crowd back so someone important could walk through, doing his job, exactly the way it was supposed to be done.